Okay, so Gendon has arrived and is ready, so we'll go ahead and get started, everyone.
Having my cursor issue again. For some reason in Zoom, my cursor like disappears from my screen and I can't, it appears every now and then. It just showed up over here, but now it's gone again. I don't know what it is. So I can't change the screen. I really want to get me off the screen and do the gallery view. Yeah, but I don't really want to look at myself here. And I can't even get to like another screen. I'll give up for now. It'll reappear. Anyway, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I think we're going to start with some prayers, and then I'll say a little bit after we do our meditation. That way we can do some prayers together first. So we'll just do, I think, refuge and bodhicitta is good enough to get things started. This feels a little weird here. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be.
And if you're here in the Gampa, you can reference page 34.
Okay. So we'll recite in English once and then the Tibetan twice. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chanyan gipe sonam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, Jangchu Bartu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay, and then let's do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance just to come into this space with a bit more focus and also to set our motivation together. So again, spend the first few minutes working with the breath in whatever way suits your mind, just bringing the awareness to the breath, whatever point or method you use for working with the breath usually. Whenever you see that the mind has wandered from the breath, then just gently guide the mind back to the breath. All right, so I'll ring the bell here and we'll do this for a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in setting motivation. So in this weekend course, we're going to be working with the topic of dependent origination, sometimes even simply called interdependence. And in setting our motivation tonight, we can already begin to apply some understanding of that concept. We live in a world of interdependence. No doubt this became very clear, especially during the pandemic, when we depended upon so many people to continue to do what they were doing, to sell us the food that we needed, the people who shipped the food, who packaged the food, who grew the food, and so on. That's just the food that we needed. So many other things that we also depended upon. And that's true for every single day of our lives, whether it was a pandemic or not. We depend upon others, and we are a part of helping them to have what they want in their life, what they need, through the work that we do, and so on. So we want to focus in particular on the beings who are a part of this net of interdependence. And we see, just again temporally, how much our welfare relies upon them. But moreover, we see how ultimately our welfare absolutely depends upon them. We cannot accomplish this goal of Buddhahood or enlightenment without sentient beings. They are the object of our bodhicitta. They are the basis upon which we practice the perfections and develop our qualities so that we can become a Buddha and help them. As Lama Zopa Rinpoche would frequently say, every single sentient being is the source of all your past, present, and future happiness. So we want to hold those sorts of sentiments as we set our motivation of bodhicitta in the way that we have benefited from others and that we will continue to benefit from their presence in this world as we develop on the path to enlightenment. We want to do all of that, practice the Dharma, go to teachings, and so on, with the aim of benefiting them, a way of reciprocating for their incredible kindness. So we dedicate ourselves to achieving Buddhahood for their sake. And this is the motivation of bodhicitta that we bring to these teachings. So just take a minute to reflect on those thoughts and set that ideal motivation for tonight. So I'm very happy to be teaching this subject. When I was working with Linda and Donna on setting up the program for this time that I'm here, I suggested this because, as many of you might recall, when Lama Zopa Rinpoche, passed away, and there was that period of time of 49 days when they were really encouraging a lot of practice and people to, recite various things. This was one of the prayers that we were requested to recite for Rinpoche. And so I thought it might be nice to do a commentary on this. I've never taught in the entire text. I actually did a brief introduction to it. It was just a single evening back in Santa Fe at our center there, Tupten Norbuling, where I was resident teacher. And that was prior to teachings that I had the good fortune to attend with His Holiness in San Francisco in 2007. And so I have received teachings on this text from His Holiness, but there are some commentaries. I've got a book list I put together that you have access to, so I'll go over some of that a little bit later. But it's really quite nice to kind of immerse myself in this whole text and go through every verse and really try to round out my own understanding on the basis of these commentaries. I even went back to the notes that I had from His Holiness, all my little scribbles in a little notebook that I still had on my shelf that I'd never put into Word or anything, so I went through and did that. I think the audio or the video recordings were available, and I do have those at home as well. I didn't get a chance to rewatch all of those, but this is a text that, again, His Holiness has great reverence for, and I'm just really delighted to be able to talk about it with all of you. So what I'd like to do to get things started is, I need to have my screen share on. Whoever is, that's all right. Because I've put together a PowerPoint presentation, and as I've done or will do for the previous evenings that I've been here, I'll put together a PDF file of those so that you can have access to the material that was shared. I'm not sharing too many slides, but I do have a couple of handouts. Again, here in the Gompa, I think they've made some copies available. Let me pull up. I think what I want to start with is actually the PowerPoint. So this is a nice little picture of Lama Tsongkhapa. I think most people know of Lama Tsongkhapa who come to Kadampa Center and who are listening to these teachings, but I will talk a little bit later about Lama Tsongkhapa. In terms of the subject matter, I want to go into this a little bit, but obviously this is something we're going to flesh out. Did it go out there? Almost sounded like it went out, but no? Okay. We're going to flesh out over the weekend, to really understand in more detail what is this concept of dependent origination, dependent arising, interdependence, what is the full import of that subject. But I thought it would be, nice to start with the heart mantra of dependent relation. I can't believe I taught on this. Kadampa Center was included in this course called Exploring Buddhism. And we went through this, and I never even gave a translation to these words, these wonderful Sanskrit words that are part of what Rinpoche advises us to recite every morning in the ritual for blessing your speech. There's this called the heart mantra of dependent relation. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava, hetun tekan tatagato hyavade, tekan zayo, nirodha evambadi maha sharmanaye swaha. So we're going to recite it together with the phonetics that they've put together. But there was a website I found that gave a little commentary on this. It says this famous mantra is actually a summary of the teachings of the Buddha. One of his first 5 disciples, the Arhat Asaji, was asked by Shariputra, a wandering ascetic, what his master taught. What did the Buddha teach? Asaji replied with this statement, of course, probably without the Om and Swaha, they say, because those are usually put on a mantra as kind of the bookends. Om being the embodiment of the body, speech, and mind of the Buddhas, and Swaha being kind of so be it, at the end of this statement, or this thus it is kind of statements. So translating those words from Sanskrit, he said, and it was, I guess, I don't know what they were conversing in, but essentially this is the translation of that. Regarding dharmas that arise from a cause, the Tathagata taught their cause and also their cessation. Those were the words of the great mendicant. It's kind of interesting because sometimes we condense down what the Buddha taught into 2 main things. He taught suffering and the end of suffering. We'll go into this more tonight, obviously, as we go into this topic. But essentially we can say suffering is something that arises from causes. Everything arises from causes. And those things can cease, through the force of changing our minds and so on. All the causes of our suffering, the suffering itself, and all of that. Anyway, this is the meaning of this mantra and gives us a flavor for what we're looking at in terms of dependent origination, though it's not exclusively in regard to things that arise from causes. But then the website that I found goes on to talk a little bit about the effect of those words upon hearing these words from Asaji. Shariputra attained to the first stage of the path, entering the stream. Stream enters are those who've had this direct realization of emptiness, the initial direct realization. And so he obviously had some huge impact from just the recitation of those words. For many centuries now, this mantra has been used to stabilize the power of blessings in one's mantra recitation, as well as to purify our Dharma practice, and especially any misunderstandings of the view, which is what we're doing this weekend and looking at the middle way view. The name we gave to this course was Clarifying the Middle Way. So let's go ahead and recite it together. Again, this is with the common pronunciation that the FPMT has in the prayer book, and we'll recite it 3 times. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetun tekan tathagato hyavade tekan sayo nirodha evambadi maha shramanaye swaha. Again, you'll notice there's that asterisk there that you pause before the yo and the ni. Otherwise, it changes the meaning. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetan tekan tatagato yavade tekan sayo nirodha evambadi maha shramana ye swaha. Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetan tekan tatagato yavade tekan sayo nirodha evambadi maha shramana ye swaha. We won't do that before every class, but I thought I'd share that with you and let you know that that is it's a wonderful mantra to recite in relation to our study and practice of this. So from there, I would like to introduce, and many of you know this topic before, but if we look at it from the point of view of what was said by Asaji, that the teachings of the Buddha can be condensed down into those words, it is important that we take a look at kind of the larger context of everything the Buddha taught. This is how we usually divide it up, is into what are called the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The Buddha was a unique being in that he came into this world specifically to do this task, to kind of set what's called the Dharma wheel in motion, to begin the teachings in this world that would help beings in this world have access to the means to attaining liberation and enlightenment. So the very first wheel turning was the very first teaching that the Buddha gave. It's often called the Dharma Chakra, or wheel turning, of the Four Noble Truths. We're going to talk about the Four Noble Truths next as kind of, or very shortly, as the schema for everything else the Buddha taught. I know many of you have had teachings on it, so I'm not going to belabor it, but it is really an amazing teaching when you reflect on it in terms of giving us the whole perspective that the Buddha had in terms of what our current circumstance is and how it could be changed through practicing what the Buddha taught. Again, that possibility that we all have for ending those things which are caused, our suffering and so on, and having the cessation of that. That was his initial starting point, and we have to say that certainly at that point, he didn't teach emptiness, this topic that is a corollary to dependent origination, in great detail, but he did teach dependent origination. As we see when we look at the Four Noble Truths, they are a process of cause and effect, which is the kind of coarsest level of dependent origination. I'll go into that again shortly. The second wheel turning is where he did teach emptiness and dependent arising at its deepest level, often called the Dharma Chakra teaching the emptiness of intrinsic existence or inherent existence. We'll look at some synonyms for that shortly. But essentially, this is a much deeper teaching, a very profound teaching. These are what are known as the Prajnaparamita teachings, the perfection of wisdom teachings. They were mainly intended for those who have an inclination towards full Buddhahood, like we did in our meditation tonight, the Bodhisattva path and so on. In the very beginning, he didn't teach so much on that, but there were unique situations, particularly at Vulture's Peak near Rajagriha, where he taught a number of these sutras. And this is really the source of the main teachings on dependent arising and emptiness that we're going to be looking at this weekend. What was interesting is that in the first one, he didn't teach the selflessness and emptiness at such a deep level. The second one, he taught it at the most profound level. They say that there was a need for kind of an in-between on those. So he went on to do the third wheel turning, the Dharma Chakra of fine discrimination. And those sutras are ones for people who weren't quite ready for the profound view, but that still needed to kind of move in that direction. In that fine discrimination, he said, some things are empty in the way that I taught in the second wheel turning, but other things aren't. So, you can kind of find that bit of a medium between those 2 points of view. So we're going to mainly be looking at, of course, this second wheel turning, where emptiness is taught, again, within the context of the full meaning of dependent origination. But all three of these levels really did speak to the reality of things arising in dependence upon other factors. Again, this is the main topic we're talking about in the first initial level, is that process where we have causes and conditions that we need to be attentive to, because if we want certain results, then we have to put those causes into place. If we want to avoid certain results, then we have to cease those causes. So all of this sounds somewhat simplistic at that level, but it leads to very profound conclusions when we take this to the furthest level. So in teaching the Four Noble Truths, of course, the Buddha was basing that initial teaching on his perspective of samsara and what's called nirvana, I have a little thing I put together that some of you may recognize from when I've taught in exploring the path or exploring the truths. I can't remember which one of those I taught this. This is what I call the tree of samsara. And many people use this analogy for things being like a tree. There's roots to a tree, kind of where it all comes from. And then there's all the things that happen up above. And so I put this into a little model that roughly correlates to what the Buddha sees as our fundamental situation. Why do we need to investigate these teachings, in other words? And that's because we are caught up in what's called the tree of samsara, this state of existence that is unsatisfactory. Might look kind of delicious with all that red fruit on it, but it's not really that good for you. It's kind of poisoned. The root, going from the bottom up, the root is the ignorance that clings to the I and all phenomena to be truly, inherently, intrinsically existent. While we're going to be looking at the topic of dependent arising, again, it's very much tied into the subject of emptiness, which is a lack of this type of existence, inherent existence. Even we can use the word independent existence. Right now, we are all under the sway of ignorance. That is misconceiving how the world exists, how we exist in the world. Of course, the primary one is that one that's mentioned here, clings to the I, the person, ourselves. And everything revolves around this sense of I. We have a strong attachment and desire for those things that we find pleasurable and that we want to continue to have in our lives. And we have a strong aversion and anger towards the things that we don't want in our lives. So those sorts of thoughts are what the trunk of the tree represents. The trunk includes our unwholesome thoughts that we generate within our ignorance, which are those minds of attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, all of these things. And then we also have some even wholesome minds. It's interesting because the wholesome states of mind, you might think, well, they're wholesome. Why would they have ignorance present? Well, they might be a little more aware of some other levels of ignorance, but they still can be together with that fundamental ignorance. We still can be misguided as to the I exists and engage in virtuous, wholesome actions. Wholesome states of mind can still be tainted by ignorance. We often use the word contaminated, that everything in this tree is contaminated because it's arising from the roots of ignorance. If the roots are removed, then of course everything is free of all of that. You do no longer have any contamination. So we have those two kinds of aspects of the trunk. It's not really demonstrated as clearly in the picture, but you would say there's sort of a wholesome and an unwholesome. There also, I guess, are a lot of things we do that aren't charged either way, kind of neutral states of mind that we have, but we don't talk about them so much in Buddhism. Maybe there are parts of our day where we're sort of spaced out and there's really nothing happening, but the big ones are, what are we doing that's more virtuous and wholesome with our minds, and what are we doing with our minds that's unwholesome and non-virtuous? Okay, so that's arising within the sphere of ignorance. Even though, again, we can do virtuous things, as long as we have that ignorance, we're only going to produce fruits, results within the tree of samsara. The branches of the tree are karma, the virtuous and non-virtuous actions that we create with those thoughts. Karma is also our thoughts, don't get me wrong. Even just having a thought creates some measure of karma. But perhaps some of the more significant things we experience in terms of suffering and happiness come from more overt actions that we do with our body physically, or that we do with our speech verbally. But absolutely, our mind is driving the whole show, so it's creating karma all the time. So we can say that that includes mental karma as well as physical and verbal karma. But that karma, those actions that we engage in, those movements of the mind and physical and verbal actions that come from it, create a seed. And again, seed doesn't fit into the analogy of the tree, but they create sort of the propensity for us to have a certain fruit ripen. That's the fourth factor in here. The fruits, and if I'd been real clever, I could have photoshopped, I suppose, some different colored fruits in there. Right now they're all red, so they all look like they're the same type. But we have some fruits that are suffering, that are unsatisfactory in a grosser way, that are really unpleasant for us to experience. And then we have others that are happiness, contaminated happiness, but nonetheless pleasure and happiness, that are all arising because we created the karma for them. One of the most fundamental laws of karma is that it's definite in terms of if we plant virtuous seeds, we get the result of karma, of karma that is virtuous, and then of course the happiness that comes from that. If we plant non-virtuous seeds, then we get the karma from that ripens into what we call suffering or unpleasant sensations and experiences. This is how karma works most definitely. Within the tree of samsara, this is how we experience all the things that we experience. This moment right now is a product of our past karma that arose from virtuous states of mind because we're all here together studying the Dharma. And those virtuous states of mind, we're still together with ignorance. So that's why we're not in nirvana, some state of freedom from all of that. And it's good to create virtue, but it's good to be off the tree of samsara once and for all. We're not denying the role that virtue plays in giving us more pleasant experiences within samsara. But hey, we've been in this tree of samsara since beginningless time. Let's uproot the damn thing and get on with it, and do some work to help others. Now, enlightenment is a state where we've gone even beyond uprooting our own ignorance and developed our own nirvana, a personal kind of freedom, where we go on to generate the ability to benefit others through removing even the subtle obscurations. And we'll look at that at a later point this weekend. But this is one schema that I put together, again, that I think works, and many teachers do talk in this way of saying kind of the roots of our suffering being ignorance, and all of this, the fruits that we experience being the suffering sensations and so on, as well as the times that we have pleasure, happiness. Let's go ahead and then look at a little sutra verse that kind of gets us into an understanding of why we need these sorts of reasonings then, why we need to look at dependent origination and other reasonings to help us to uproot that ignorance. This is from the Sutra of Questions Posed by Rashtrapala, and I don't remember whose translation this is. This was from when I taught this the first time, and I didn't mark it clearly enough, so to find a quote again after that many years, it's kind of hard. Because they don't know the meaning of shunyata or nirvana, shunyata is the Sanskrit for emptiness, beings are forced to wander in samsara. Because Buddha has such great compassion for them, he leads them by using numerous reasons and methods. So this is what we're dealing with. We're in the tree of samsara. Buddha sees us in this state. We don't know the meaning of emptiness, which will uproot that ignorance. We don't know the exact opposite. Right now we cling to everything as if it was intrinsically, inherently existent, and we don't have the ability to be free of that. We're always dealing with this contaminated existence. And Buddha in his compassion looks upon us and says, hey, these folks need an out. These folks need a way to get out of this mess that they're in. Just as the Buddha himself learned from his masters and so on, and eventually was able to achieve the state of enlightenment, so too does he want all of us to achieve the same realizations. That's what, when we generate bodhicitta, that's the mind that we're generating, is to become just like the Buddha, so we can join the Buddha and all the enlightened beings in that same task, to help others out of our compassion for them to be free. So we need these reasonings. And the reasoning that we're going to be looking at, as you know, is the reasoning of dependent arising. And we'll look at the little sheet on that in a bit, where we go into a little bit more detail of what we mean by those words and what's the import of it. But there are many reasonings that the Buddha taught that can help us. Some of them are a bit more analytical and a little more challenging to work with. In the Master's program, this topic of emptiness and dependent arising is covered most extensively in the text that we study, Chandrakirti's text, Supplement to the Middle Way. And it's really quite amazing. You go through a number of these reasonings, and you get quite familiar with all the ins and outs of them. And of course, the goal is not just to know them intellectually, to be able to say, oh, this is the reasoning of the sevenfold reasoning of Chandrakirti and give all the points. It's to actually use them as a tool, to investigate the nature of reality for ourselves, to undermine our ignorance for ourselves. Again, there are different levels of ignorance, as I stated, and most beings don't even have the knowledge of what we're dealing with. They don't know about the tree of samsara. They don't know about the Four Noble Truths. I want to go ahead and introduce the Four Noble Truths and work with them a little bit. When His Holiness taught this in San Francisco in 2007, when I went to those teachings, he actually began with a little investigation of the Four Noble Truths, and I'm going to replicate a little bit of what he did. Not as good as he did it, but I'll do my best. These are what most of us know already as these Four Noble Truths. Noble meaning those beings who've had that insight into reality, into the nature of reality at a deep level. They can speak to the absolute validity of these. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't. We can speak to the validity of them from our own investigation, but we do still have to, remind ourselves of these things constantly. We haven't gotten it fully. As Venerable Rabina says, the penny hasn't completely dropped. We've gotten kind of there to some degree, can affect us, but we haven't gotten the full import of these four truths. And as I said, this is where the Buddha's teachings began. He starts out by telling us what our situation is, the truth of dukkha. Dukkha, again, this is the Sanskrit version. It's the same word sounding. It's spelled a little different in the Pali. But dukkha has been translated in various places as suffering, but it's much more than that. It refers to a state of dissatisfaction that we are all in. And whether we're experiencing something that is miserable, that is easy to identify as dukkha, or even something that is pleasant, there's an unsatisfactoriness to it. And that's because we're under the control of the second of the truths, the causes or the origins of dukkha, which are not the things outside of ourselves that cause us harm at times, people, objects, what have you. It's the forces within us, which, as we saw in the tree of samsara, are our delusions, the afflictions, the states of mind that arise within our ignorance. And ignorance itself, of course, is a delusion. Affliction, we use different words for it. It's the same essential term. And then the karma, the actions that we engage in on the basis of that. These are what the Buddha identified as the two main causes of dukkha. So in the first two truths, the Buddha's rubbing our nose in it a bit, and kind of saying, guess what, folks? You need to wake up to this reality. You need to get that this is what's happening to you and that you're causing it through your own states of mind. You created the tree of samsara through your own ignorance and through your continuing to buy into that, through the delusions that arise from it, and even the wholesome states of mind that arise from it. And you are not going to be free until you're free of that ignorance. That's where we go into the other two truths that speak to nirvana, the potential that we all have to achieve a cessation, an end once and for all, to dukkha and its causes. And how is that accomplished? Through the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of dukkha and its causes. So even in the four noble truths, we have a relationship of dependent origination, right? We can say that the Buddha was initially saying dependent origination in terms of our unwholesome state that we are in, the state of samsara. That it is from the causes of samsara that our dukkha arises. From our karma and delusions, therefore we experience suffering. And there are many other factors involved, obviously, in how we experience that and so on. But these are the main elements that point to the crisis that we're experiencing. The last two speak to the causes and conditions that will lead to the end of all of that. That if we practice the path, which is essentially boiled down to having a stable foundation of good morality, a higher training in that. We often call these the three higher trainings. Have the higher training in concentration on the basis of that, and then the higher training in wisdom, where we actually generate the wisdom of emptiness and uproot that ignorance. All of that can be accomplished, but it's a causal process. If we don't create the causes, we don't get the results. If we continue to create the causes to be in samsara, we will continue to experience that result. This is why the Buddha taught these four noble truths. So let me take it off screen for a little bit. I want to talk a bit about how His Holiness presented this, because this is also embedded within the very first sutra. Some of you, I'm sure, have read the Sutra of the Four Noble Truths in Geshe Tashi Sering's book. That's part of the Foundation of Buddhist Thought series. When he was at Jamyang in London and would teach that course, there's like a 6-volume series. This is the volume on emptiness, and it's quite nice. It starts with that sutra. Because this sutra really, it's the Four Noble Truths one, not the emptiness one. Getting my subjects mixed up. The one on the Four Noble Truths. He has 6 again in the series. There's a nice one on emptiness too, but the one on the Four Noble Truths starts with that sutra. The sutra is taught in terms of 3 ways of kind of understanding how we relate to each of these truths. So first one, the truth of dukkha. We first need to, of course, recognize that this is all about the the nature of our experience, the nature of what it is that we're actually, going through. And that's sort of the first level that the Buddha went through in regard to each of these. What is the nature of that particular truth? The second question that the Buddha was answering was then, well, based on that nature, what is it that we need to do in relation to that? How do we, come to discern that nature or actualize that nature or what have you? What is, the embodiment of the knowledge of that nature, the culmination of that nature? And then the third one is, how do we know when we've reached that culmination? How is it that kind of the final goal or aim of our practice? So let's go through in regard to suffering. So the truth of suffering or dukkha is to be known, to be understood. So first the Buddha says what it is, which is what I was explaining earlier, that everything we experience in this conditioned existence is tainted, is unsatisfactory. The second is that we then have to know that. We have to understand that. We have to really get it. Again, we have to get the penny to drop on that one to some degree so that we actually live from that place of understanding that what we're involved in is not a pleasure palace. This isn't, a day at the park that we're having. This is actually a prison that we are in. Then the third one is when we kind of understand when there are no more sufferings to be known. We kind of bring it to that conclusion that eventually we have actualized the knowledge of that suffering, when we have gotten it completely. And of course, that happens at a much deeper level when we have achieved the noble state, the Arya state, and we can speak to the Four Noble Truths from that perspective. It's also interesting when we talk about that third level, His Holiness often points out how that third level can also be speaking to the fact that when they say there are no more sufferings, no more dukkha to be understood, that we also understand them to not have any intrinsic existence, to not exist inherently. We'll get into all these subjects as we go forward. So essentially we say that there are three things we need to do with true dukkha. We need to first come to understand its nature, and then of course to use that understanding to eventually have an end to whatever additional knowledge we need of it. We know suffering completely. With regard to the second noble truth, the causes of that, we need to kind of eliminate. So we have to eliminate or abandon the causes of suffering, right? That's the goal. So we first understand the nature of suffering, of the causes of suffering, dukkha. Then we come to understand or to know the abandonment of that. That's the action. And we get to the point of concluding it by saying there are no more causes of suffering to abandon. That's, of course, culminates when we achieve nirvana. With regard to the fourth or third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of dukkha, the Buddha said that this is to be actualized. So that again is a similar process, that we actually understand what a true cessation is, a complete end that can be accomplished through the path, and we'll go into this again throughout this weekend. Then we have the process of actualizing it through engaging in the teachings and the meditations and so on. And then we get to a point where there are no more cessations to be actualized, when you have actualized all the cessations of dukkha and you experience the freedom of nirvana. With regard to the fourth noble truth, the true paths, those are to be cultivated. So we have first understanding the nature of the path, that it's the three higher trainings and so on, and then we go through the cultivation of the path through engaging in the teachings and cultivating those trainings within our own minds. And then we come to a place where there are no more paths to be cultivated. We have cultivated the culmination of the paths, which of course happens at its deepest degree when we achieve Buddhahood. Even attaining nirvana, though, is a completion to some degree of the paths that are necessary for that goal. So the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths in a very dynamic way about a causal process again. We have to see the truths for what they are, know their nature. We have to engage in an action in relation to them, and we have to bring it to its fulfillment, its culmination. Whatever these Four Noble Truths are, the knowledge of them, the awareness of them, the bringing them deeply into our experience is the goal, essentially. And that's a dynamic process. Again, it's something that is about causal relationships. If we create the causes for this process to come to its fulfillment, then it will happen. There's a little phrase I was reading that came from Chogyam Trungpa about how we are doomed for enlightenment, hate to say it, you're doomed for enlightenment. You put these causes into place and you will eventually achieve enlightenment. In fact, all of us will eventually achieve enlightenment. That's the view that is held within this tradition. Once the causes and conditions are in place, but you are doomed for samsara as long as you continue to do what you do. So understanding the Four Noble Truths, which is not the main topic, obviously, of this weekend, is a good foundation, again, for deepening our awareness of the necessity of investigating topics like this. And of course, of the import of what Lama Tsongkhapa was speaking about when he taught this text, that he knew that there was a relevance to it that is critical. If we are to actualize these Four Noble Truths in our lives, a complete knowledge of true dukkha, complete abandonment of the true causes of it, the complete cessation of those causes through having actualized that, through having completely cultivated the path, then we need to know the principle of dependent arising, which leads us to a perfect understanding of emptiness. All right. So another way, though, that the Buddha did approach the topic of what we're caught up in, and this won't be a huge teaching, and don't freak out when you see these 12 on the screen. Many of you have had teachings on this, and I taught on this in Exploring the Path, or the Truths, I think was that module of Exploring Buddhism that I did for Kadampa Center and many other centers in North America. These are called the 12 links of dependent origination. There's those wonderful words, dependent origination, dependent arising. This was a way that the Buddha taught how we are caught up in a process of causes and conditions that lead us to cycle in existence. Essentially, when I go through this in a very shorthand way, these are not meant to be completely linear in terms of a single life. They actually have overlapping lives. But from a moment of ignorance, just a moment of ignorance, when we create karma, the next link, compositional action, that karma gets imprinted on our consciousness. Then, having attained a state of existence, what are called name and form here, which is referring to kind of the body and mind, of the composite that we have, mind and body, to be more correct in terms of name is mind, form is body. We then have sense sources, an ability to experience things through our 5 usual senses as well as through our mental sense. We come into contact with objects. We have feelings of pleasure and pain, and then we crave to be together with those feelings of pleasure and to abandon the feelings of pain, not experience them. And we even grasp at that, a heightened sense of craving, and particularly at the end of that life where we have all of that happening, we ripen a karmic seed. The 10th link, existence, is giving the name of the result to the cause. It's the karmic that we created in number 2 that has now come forth and is ready to propel us into our next life. So we see there are 2 lives involved in here. There's a life that you have where you are creating the causes to be propelled into the next life. And then there's a life where you create that karma. And they can be the same, but we don't have a ripening of that karma that we created in this set until we get to that 10th link, till we get to the end of this life. And due to what's happening on our deathbed, the states of mind that we have, the conditions that we've created, a particular karmic seed is going to ripen and take you into the last 2 links, into a birth, which is not technically birth coming out of the womb in a human existence, it's conception. It is the initial moment of the beginning of that next existence. So then everything else that follows, I mentioned this the other night with regard to conscious aging, is aging and then eventually death. And then we repeat the cycle again. We have, when we die with a mind that is still with ignorance, and we have a karmic seed that gets ripened due to our craving and grasping at the end, and then it propels us into another existence. And then throughout that life, we're starting new links. The first 3 links, it's technically 2.5 because consciousness ends up getting divided into 2. We're creating those every time we have a karma that is kind of capable of propelling us into another existence. We imprint it on the mind, and then eventually it will ripen into a full existence if it has the opportunity. Obviously, there's a lot of those seeds out there. But my main kind of point in presenting this to you, His Holiness touched on it extremely briefly. And that's because we can see that even in this schema of how the Buddha talked about what we're caught up in, which is essentially a more detailed model of what happens in the tree of samsara that I was showing you, that we do have a causal process going on. that there is from this that arises, from ignorance arise compositional actions, from the compositional actions and consciousness, meaning consciousness that is imprinted with that karmic action, and then and so on. All of these things are arising from other factors. And of course, the Buddha was implicitly teaching the Four Noble Truths within that, saying, okay, this is the process by which you have all these various results that we can call suffering. There are causes for it, the main one being ignorance. That's the root. And there can be a cessation. If you stop the ignorance, then the whole house of cards falls apart, right? You pull that bottom card out, it's gone. And, of course, how we do that is by abandoning these things, actually cultivating, the path that will cause that to occur. So it's all implicit within this teaching. It's all about the factors of dependent arising, things arising, coming into existence, originating from something else, something we identify as other, but again, as we get into this, we'll see how elusive that even is. Things aren't completely inherently other, they are relatedly other, everything in relation with other factors. So I think, and again, why the Dalai Lama introduced these topics is because they get you into the ballpark of understanding, as we'll see in the handout when we look at it, that dependent arising is kind of the Buddhist slogan. It's like, it should be on all of our t-shirts, right? We belong to the school of dependent arising. And of course, this was the great teaching that came out of India from the Nalanda tradition. In fact, His Holiness often talks about how we can consider ourselves to be part of the Nalanda monastery tradition, this wonderful monastery, great seat of thinking and philosophy that existed in India in that first millennium. It was really quite phenomenal in terms of the great masters that came out of that. We'll talk about some of their names shortly. But this is the legacy of all these great beings that Lama Tsongkhapa himself came to discern through his own practice. And even when we look at the Pali Canon, I just want to point out this wonderful little saying. Some of you know of the Dhammapada. Dhammapada is this wonderful collection of sayings of the Buddha. It's kind of a condensation of so much of what the Buddha taught. And even in those, because again, the Pali Canon was the initial dissemination of the Buddha's teachings. After the Buddha passed away, all the teachings, believe it or not, were held in memory by many great masters who had developed these incredible skills through their meditation to be able to retain huge discourses of the Buddha. Over the course of centuries, they were eventually written down and began to disseminate within Asia primarily, and then eventually, of course, have made it to other parts of the world. The Pali Canon was the first sort of basic teachings that the Buddha gave that were very instrumental in the spread of Buddhism. The Sanskrit teachings that we study in the Mahayana tradition came much later. But in the Dhammapada, he says I think this is Dhammapada. Actually, no, I've got something else written down here. The Greater Discourse, the Mahanidana Sutra, but I could have swore someone else said this was in the Dhammapada. But nonetheless, it's in the Pali Canon, we know that. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma, or as they call it in Pali, Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. That essentially, if you take everything the Buddha taught, he was teaching dependent origination all the time. And not at the level that we see in that second wheel turning, to go back to that earlier screen. We have the initial teaching of a process of things coming into existence, our samsaric existence that we have. Then we have things coming into existence, nirvana, if we practice the truth that leads to that, the path that leads to that. And then we have the 12 links to dependent origination, all these various ways that the Buddha presented that things are arising in dependence upon other factors. That very teaching in and of itself is a teaching of emptiness. Because if things arise on the basis of other factors, they can't exist intrinsically, inherently, and so on, independently. This is our main topic of what we're looking at this weekend and trying to generate some understanding of it. To do that, we also have to kind of get more aware of what this really means to say inherent or intrinsic existence. This is a big, set of words for us to get our minds around and to really understand what that means. But we're going to come back around to that. I really want to focus on dependent arising and trying to reinforce these teachings of how things are dependent originations. They actually have that as their nature, so that we can then come and back it into emptiness and really have a deeper appreciation and understanding for emptiness. All right. So we do have this little handout. Again, I will put it on the screen for those of you who didn't get a chance to print it out. You might find it useful to refer to at some point, certainly. This is not what I wanted to share, but it is there we go.
This can be found online on the Kadampa Center's website electronically. If you just go to kadampa-center.org.
Great.
And probably the first picture that comes up on the banner is Gendon. Click on that and then look down a little ways and it'll say something like course materials for the weekend workshop. And the one that we have pulled up right now is the Clarifying the Middle Way handout is what it's called.
Yeah, this is the real only like kind of informational handout that I have for all of you. The other things are the text itself, the outline of the text and so on, a little resource page with some additional materials, and I'll go through that a little bit later tonight, at least to introduce you to those. So on this handout, at the very beginning, we have these wonderful verses that come from Arya Nagarjuna. You'll hear his name quite a bit this weekend. He is renowned as one of the Nalanda masters that kind of explained the middle way point of view that we're looking at this weekend, what this Madhyamika, this middle way really is, and how it is informed by dependent origination. So in his Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, sometimes just abbreviated to Fundamental Wisdom, this is kind of one of the most important chapters, chapter 24. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama often teaches on 3 main chapters. One of them on the 12 links of dependent origination, which I think is 26, and then 18, which is on the self, and then 24, which is on the Four Noble Truths. So anyway, these are really key Madhyamika, middle way verses. That which is dependent origination is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way. The middle way between these two extremes, we'll talk about them shortly, this perfect pathway that gets you to the goal is rooted in dependent origination. It is dependent origination, that things arise in dependence upon other factors. That gets you to the realization of emptiness. He says then in the next verse, there does not exist anything that is not dependently arisen. Therefore, there does not exist anything that is not empty. So emptiness and dependent origination, throughout the weekend, we're talking about these two becoming very much enmeshed, so that in essence, they are the same nature. It's just two ways of looking at things that exist, everything that exists. Because as I said there's nothing that exists which is not dependently arisen. There's therefore nothing that is also not empty. Everything is empty of inherent existence. Everything is a dependently originating. Okay. Now, it's kind of interesting. I'll take it off screen for just a moment and talk about how one of the versions of this text that I found actually has those 2 verses from Nagarjuna as like the starting point for Lama Tsongkhapa's text. And I don't know if I don't really gather from the commentaries I've had as to why that is. When His Holiness taught it, they weren't there. But it's kind of interesting, Lama Tsongkhapa himself obviously had a deep reverence for Nagarjuna and his teachings in fundamental wisdom. And that's where this view that Tsongkhapa followed was initially taught, to him through Nagarjuna and the followers of Nagarjuna. Again, we'll get their names all coming up shortly. So these 2 are very important verses that really speak to what we are dealing with, the reality of dependent origination and emptiness being mutually compatible, right together, with each other. So, all right, so now let's carry on with the commentary I put together for you. I put this into parts, and we'll go through some of this tonight. Some of this we're going to hold on to until later points in the weekend. There's a wonderful book called Dependent Arising and Emptiness by Elizabeth Napper, but don't think because of the title that it's kind of just going to be an explanation of that only. Oh, I've got something else on the screen somehow. That's weird. It came up on mine, but I don't know how that did it. How weird. Okay, let me try that. Did that do it? No, that's not doing it either. You know this, we had this problem the other night, right? Because I did something to fix it. Let me get out of what I might have to do. Whoop. Yeah, I may have to find where I was. It's like, I think 12 or 13 in the slides, and go back to it when I go back to that. Okay, I think it should come up now from Zoom when I do my screen share. Okay, sorry folks on Zoom, we're trying to correct things here in the Gompa. It's not working. I don't know why it's not sharing. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna work with it because we need to kind of move on, because technology sometimes is, yeah. It's weird we're not getting it to come up here. I mean, this has been an interesting trip, because I mean, I think I've done this sort of screen sharing before, but it's a little more, I don't know. No, I think it's Shanti Deva, we had some issues up there too. I think it's just the ghost in the machine. So anyway, this book by Elizabeth Napper, just so you know, it's a rather heavy book too, because it's got a lot of translations of various texts by Tsongkhapa and annotations on those, and it's not like a simple little handbook on dependent arising and emptiness. The beginning of it is quite nice, and this passage is in the beginning, so I think you'll get something out of this, because the introduction is really quite sweet. She says, dependent arising and emptiness are two crucial concepts within Buddhism. Difficult to understand and subject to a variety of interpretations, an understanding of them and of their compatibility can serve as a key revealing the essence of the Buddha's teachings. So this is what we're talking about, the compatibility, the fact that emptiness and dependent arising, just kind of come together and totally complement each other. In very brief form, this is in her introduction to her book, she says, dependent arising, labeled by the present Dalai Lama as Buddha's slogan, indicates the interrelatedness of all things in the universe. Things arise dependent on causes and conditions. They gain their identities in relation to other things. Nothing stands alone. What was that thing we said? The cheese stands alone. The cheese stands alone. I don't know why that comes to mind, but those words. But the cheese doesn't stand alone, okay? The cheese comes from the milk, that comes from the cow, that comes from, it's like there's a whole causal process, and that's only a few of the causes, right? Okay, so nothing stands alone, autonomous and isolated, but instead exists only in a web of interconnectedness, like near and far. All things are relative. What is near and far? Well, it's relative, right? For an ant, from myself to Linda is probably far. For a human, it's near, right? It really depends on what you're comparing it to. What is the relative nature of things? It's always going to be conditional, right? So they are relative, dependent on their causes, on their parts, and on their relationship to something else. Again, we'll get into more details about the specific ways that we can talk about dependent origination. Things are always in flux, always changing. There are no independent, autonomous entities. Of course, and that's what we mean by emptiness to some degree, right? Is the lack of things having those qualities, autonomy, independence, intrinsic identity, and so on. So that's why she goes on to talk about emptiness. Having talked about dependent arising, she says emptiness expresses the same idea from another viewpoint. All things are empty. Empty of what, right? Because the word emptiness on its own doesn't really say much, right? I mean, things are empty. Well, empty of what? Like a cup, I can say, well, if I dump all the water out, the cup is empty. It's empty of water. You always still have to say, or of some liquid. You have to have something things are empty of. So what are they empty of? She says, of being independent, autonomous entities, of having some own thing. This is also a term that Jeffrey Hopkins uses in one of his books. Kind of having my own thing. I've got my own thing, The idea is you have your own identity. Things have their own identity. This has an identity of book that is established here. This has an identity of paper. All of these things seem to have their own thing, but they are empty of having that. They don't have that autonomous, independent identity. Again, an intrinsic nature, she goes on to say, that comes from their own side without depending on external causes and conditions or on a subjective factor of those who observe them. That things exist somehow, again, in that independent space. And this is what we're exploring this weekend, is the idea of emptiness that is a complement to dependent arising. Things exist dependently, therefore they lack independent, autonomous existence. In those words, it makes absolute sense, right? Yet we have a problem seeing them as complementary. Continuing about the fourth line of that paragraph, she says, as solid, substantial, and graspable as things, persons, tables, chairs, or anything may seem, when sought among the parts that make them up, there is nothing that can be pointed to as that thing itself. Here she's kind of talking about many of the methodologies that are used to find emptiness, that are, again, the other reasonings that I was mentioning earlier that the Buddha gave us. You go looking for kind of that autonomous, independent thing, and you don't find it. The not finding is the emptiness. I cannot find it. It doesn't exist. It lacks that. The non-finding of something when it is sought analytically is its emptiness, as I just said. If things existed in the palpable, independent way we imagine them to, they would have to be such that they could be found when sought, but they cannot. In fact, when sought analytically in this way in meditation, they disappear altogether. They cannot withhold analysis. They can't withstand it, because when we go looking for the actual thing, there's nothing there. We find the lack of that. So this is what we speak of when we speak of emptiness. She goes on to say, when searching among the parts or collection of the parts of a table for the table, or among the mind and body for the person, and not coming up with the object sought, at some point the conventional phenomenon drops away and one is left with only the absence of what was sought, with the mere vacuity, that is emptiness. This is, again, what we are ideally wanting to aim for, is to kind of analyze things to get to a place where we see that that fictitious way that they exist, and happens to also be how they appear to exist, that doesn't exist at all. That's what we mean by coming to the conclusion of emptiness. But it is not an absolute kind of totally unrelated thing to dependent arising. It is the complement to dependent arising. When we see that things lack independent, autonomous existence through their emptiness, they have kind of an understanding of that through dependent arising, that they too lack any autonomy because they depend upon other factors. Things come into existence in dependence upon those things, therefore they cannot have any independent status. Again, complementary, totally complementary, but takes a while to get there. Again, let me share and continue on the next page. So we finished the first page. We have here now the fact of meditative experience might lead to the conclusion that emptiness and the conventional world are incompatible, through that experience that she was just talking about, where when you finally get to the place of that vacuity, that emptiness, there are no conventional things appearing. The table that you were analyzing and trying to find to exist in that way is no longer appearing. That emptiness causes ordinary phenomena which would exist so long as one has not realized emptiness, and would cease to do so once emptiness is realized. This is kind of the conclusion that you might think you'd be drawn to, is that emptiness annihilates the conventional world. If things don't exist intrinsically, inherently, independently, they don't exist at all. And that mind that is looking for them finds that emptiness, finds that vacuity, finds that they don't exist. You don't actually find the object, you find the lack of it in the way that you were holding it before. So you might even have the thought as she continues, perhaps all that we see around us is only an illusion, a fabrication of our lack of understanding of the true nature of reality, which is only emptiness. Now it's interesting, we do say things are like an illusion, but here she's saying we might falsely come to the conclusion that things are only an illusion. The Buddha never said that this is all an illusion, that we're all just in a big dream. He said they are like a dream, like an illusion. We're going to be talking about this. One of Lama Tsongkhapa's verses talk about the illusory nature of things, but it's an illusory nature, not an illusion. The real world is real in some manner, but not real in the way that we think it is. We are never completely discounting the conventional world that we experience. And in fact, we need that conventional world. That's one half of the equation. That's a dependent arising that's together with the emptiness. It's all working in tandem. So, but what is one to do then with dependent arising if that's the case? All these things, the conclusions you might come to. How does such a nihilistic emptiness fit with the Buddha's carefully formulated teachings, such as the doctrine of karma, responsibility for the effects of all one's actions, and with the instructions on proper ethics and the precise delineations of the many varieties of phenomena? Why bother if all this is false, only illusion? So again, if you understand the process by which, and we'll go into this as part of the weekend too, you come to realize emptiness through dependent arising, then you might think it's negated dependent arising, that in some way things don't exist at all. These are questions, it says, which Buddhists have struggled over the more than 2,000 years since the time of the Buddha, and numerous different schools and sects have arisen based on different ways of resolving these and other questions. The dilemma concerning the relationship of dependent arising and emptiness is a particular issue for the middle way, or Madhyamika school, sometimes pronounced Madhyamika, middle way. Founded by the great Indian scholar and yogi Nagarjuna in the early centuries of our era, Madhyamika has consistently been a focus of doctrinal controversy. Other philosophical schools do not take as uncompromising a stance regarding emptiness and the utter unfindability of objects, and as a result, Madhyamika has been accused by other schools, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist, as having gone too far and fallen into nihilism. Even within Madhyamika, varying strands of interpretation have arisen as later commentators worked out their own solutions to the accusations of conflict between emptiness and conventional phenomena, between emptiness and dependent arising. And I don't want to comment too much on that, but this is essentially pointing to the fact that what we're dealing with here is a pretty profound concept, folks. And I hope we're all kind of, make sure your seatbelts are on or something, buckle your seatbelts, because it's going to be a bumpy ride. This is the whole thing with this branch of Buddhism that we're studying, is that this is a crucial realization, but not an easy one. One that we really do have to spend some time and energy meditating on, learning frequently. One teaching on this subject is not enough. We have to receive teachings from many masters, especially masters who have realized emptiness, like His Holiness and so on. I think has realized emptiness and so on. But this is a very controversial stance, because we are essentially saying that it is because things arise dependently with all these other factors that they therefore are empty of any intrinsic existence. They exist in the slightest way possible. And it's contrary to how things appear. As I mentioned earlier, there is also this false appearance that is playing into the whole game, that is giving us a confidence that things do exist the way they appear, but they don't exist that way at all. Let me use an analogy that the Buddha even frequently used. I just mentioned it a short while ago, dreams. If your dreams are like my dreams, I don't know your dreams because I don't know your mind, but I am assuming, based on the way we talk about dreams, when I'm in my dream state, and I don't have very little lucid dreaming, I can't, maybe a couple of times I've been aware that I've been dreaming. Usually I'm just totally sucked into it, right? It's as real as the waking world. And all this stuff is appearing and I'm buying into it completely, 100%. That's why we often even have very emotional experiences in our dreams, something very frightening, a nightmare and so on, or something that is very enticing. We wake up and go, oh, I really wish I was back there, it was such a wonderful place to be, or whatever. That's because in dreams, everything appears to exist in a very real way, and we buy into it 100% when we're under the control of the dreaming mind. We just, believe it is real, and we want to experience it in that way, or if it's something pleasant, or we want to abandon it completely if it's unpleasant. It's kind of a mirror of our daily life. But the fortune of dreams is a fortunate thing is that we are able to wake up from our dreams. We're able to kind of go, oh, wow, that was only a dream. Those things aren't real in the way that they appeared. They did appear real, though. Well, right now, it's as if we're in a dream. It's like a dream, and that everything that appears to us, ourselves, all the phenomena in the world, appear to exist from their own side, appear to be real. in a very similar way, I think, to the way dream objects appear real, but it's not identical. They have a sense of reality that is being kind of established on their own, having their own identity, all these things that we talk about. So what we need to do is wake up. We need to come out of that dream. We need to not buy into things in the way that they appear. And we need a reasoning and logic to help us to do that. And this reasoning of dependent arising will help us to break free of that, to see the emptiness of that, to see that things don't exist in the way that they appear. And we are going really far. I remember we're going to introduce briefly some of these different tenet systems, they're called. I'm not going to go into them in detail either. That's not part of this weekend. We are said to be in sort of the highest philosophical tenets of the Buddha, the real deep end. Our teaching assistant over in the master's program, Jampa Gendan, he said that all these other views that the Buddha taught are kind of like wading out into the deeper and deeper part of the lake, but we still kind of want to hold on to a life preserver in the midst of all of these very, temporary views that are kind of getting us to challenge things. We'll go into some of those tomorrow. Eventually you need to let go of the life preserver, folks. And trust that it's okay. You're not going to drown. It's all right. This is where Chogyam Trungpa uses this example of I hate to tell you folks, but you're plummeting to earth, without a parachute. And the good news is that there's no ground. At some level, we kind of work with this idea of it's okay. We're not gonna crash. If we actually adopt this view, it'll be the best thing for us. And that's again what we're trying to explore this weekend, to not allow ourselves to be frightened by the profundity of this middle way. As Elizabeth Napper says, this is a very profound view. I don't think there were any other slides I needed to share on this one. Actually, no, there is. Let me go to the slides, sorry, and just share a couple of things, because it is important that you kind of get some grounding in the Sanskrit for this. I got to go back to the slideshow thing, and then maybe that'll come up there. Yes, it did. Good. At least we got that working. Okay. The word dependent arising in Sanskrit is pratitya samutpada. It has two parts. Pratitya, a continuative, meaning having depended, and samutpata, an action noun, meaning arising. This is why we frequently call it dependent arising, dependent originating. And interdependence isn't quite the full flavor, but it has that connotation. The prasangikas are the school we're studying. And like I said, that's the highest tenet system. It's called prasangika madhyamika or madhyamika. Prasangika literally translates to consequence. So sometimes it's called the consequence school. This school, the prasangikas, say that samutpada does not just mean arising, which is literally going out in the sense of arising from causes and conditions in the way that a sprout arises from a seed. It also means establishment, which in the Sanskrit is siddha or dupa in Tibetan, and existence, sat or yopa, two words that are often used interchangeably in Buddhist terminology. So it's not just that, we have something that has causes and conditions that is involved in this. Actually, we say everything that exists, we saw this earlier, right, is a dependent origination. Not just like sprouts and seeds and what have you, because there are some things actually that don't arise from causes and conditions, but still are dependent arisings. We'll talk about those later. The term pratitya samutpada thereby refers not just to products or things which arise from causes, but also to non-products, since their existence is also relative. All phenomena are dependent arisings. Okay. So let me, I'll advance to the next slide, but then I'm going to go to the handout again. Okay, so we're on the second page of the handout still, and let's go on to point 2. Point 2 is regarding this middle way between these two extremes. I've already talked a little bit about the fact that this allows you to find this middle ground so that you are, kind of able to get to the path. Well, this middle way is said to be the perfect pathway between two extremes. By two extremes, we mean two extreme points of view. And one of them we already kind of touching on with regard to that last paragraph, which is when some people hear the teachings on dependent arising, They think, oh, this means that things don't exist at all. That's this nihilistic bent. So it's often called the extreme of annihilation. So let's see what Jeffrey Hopkins says about this and the other one. He says in Meditation on Emptiness, without considering the difference between Prasangika and the other middle way school, Svatantrika, which doesn't go as far in what it's positing in terms of the meaning of dependent arising and emptiness. The definition of a Madhyamaka, a middle way practitioner in general, is a proponent of Buddhist tenets who totally refutes all extremes of permanence, which is that any phenomena ultimately exists, that anything that has any sort of mode of establishment from its own side, again, this thing that we are refuting, and it also refutes all extremes of annihilation, that phenomena do not even exist conventionally. So we have these kind of two, let me read the next little part and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. Therefore, all Madhyamakas, all middle way practitioners, whether they be the consequence Prasangika school or what's called the autonomy Svatantrika school, avoid the extreme of permanence or existence through refuting that phenomena ultimately exist, truly exist, or exist as their own reality. So they refute that things have that intrinsic existence or separate existence, ultimate existence, by positing emptiness, refuting that. They also avoid the extreme of annihilation or non-existence through asserting that all phenomena still exist conventionally or nominally, even though they lack inherent existence. So let me take it off screen. These are a lot of words. I realize that we're throwing a lot of words at you on a Friday night when we're probably a bit tired from our week, but you have these two extremes. Again, the extreme that we are kind of more firmly embedded in, they don't call it an extreme sometimes because you almost have to come to that through some sort of tenet systems, but we can say that this is where our minds are currently, is we think everything has some intrinsic identity. And it appears that way, and we assent to it. We agree to it 100%. That's why we're in the trouble that we're in. That's why the tree of samsara grows, is because that ignorance is operative. Because we think everything is as real as it appears. We refute that by understanding the lack of that reality through the wisdom that is investigating to see if things exist in that way. Just like the wisdom that we could have that investigates our dream objects. If you were able to bring that into your dream and say, does that dream appearance exist in the way that it appears? Well, let me try doing something really weird and see what happens to it. And the dream object, disappears or does some other thing, and you go, it doesn't have the reality that I would expect it to have based on my, non-dreaming experience. The idea is that we have to kind of overcome that extreme. The middle way view gets you there by positing an emptiness of any intrinsic existence, any existence of independence, autonomy. Over here, we have the extreme of things not existing at all, which, as we said with Elizabeth Napper's words, means what happens often when we do get into a philosophical investigation and we come to not find things. Things don't exist at all. I don't exist at all. When we kind of start thinking, oh my gosh, what's the point of anything if there is no existence? We hear this from even Buddhist practitioners, right? Well, if there's no self, what difference does it make? I mean, I've heard a couple people say that, kind of like, it makes all the difference because there's no self. And we mean, again, no intrinsic self, no inherently existent self. We don't mean no self at all, because over here, how we get out of that extreme of annihilation is by positing that the self still exists, albeit in a very, very subtle way, as a dependent arising, as something that comes into existence based on other factors. So we avoid the extreme through the middle way that is the combination, again, of emptiness and dependent arising itself, by virtue of focusing on how things actually exist, is one of the most beneficial tools to help us to get to a realization of emptiness. Because you can't fall into the extreme of annihilation if you think things arise, right? If they are existent. As was said just a few slides ago, right, when we said arising, according to the Prasangikas, doesn't mean just coming into existence from causes and conditions. It means mere existence. Things exist because they are pratitya samutpada, right? They are dependent arisings, dependently originated. Therefore, they cannot possibly not exist. Folks who exist, don't think that you're walking away from tonight thinking, maybe Don said I don't exist at all. You exist, you're here. How you exist is a whole nother issue. And that's what we're trying to get at. Through understanding dependent arising, we have the clearest view of emptiness, and the one that will absolutely refute these two extremes. Okay? Let's carry on with what Jeffrey has to say. The word madhyama itself, in Madhyamika, refers to the middle way, that things are, the profound meaning of dependent arising, free from the two extremes, permanence and annihilation. By the way, there are other terms for these. Permanence, sometimes called existence, eternalism, annihilation, nihilism, deprecation, non-existence. The extremes here are misrepresentations of existence and non-existence, things existing inherently or not existing at all, utter non-existence. Because phenomena do not exist ultimately, the ultimate existence of phenomena is an extreme of existence. Let me say that again. Because phenomena do not exist ultimately, the ultimate existence of phenomena is an extreme of existence. So if you hold things to have ultimate existence, final existence, that means they exist in the way that they appear. That is an extreme. We don't want to hold to that. I know we use this word ultimately when we talk about ultimate truth. That's not quite the identical to here. Here we're saying ultimate existence means things existing the way they appear. They appear to inherently exist, well then they must exist that way. That must be their final mode of existence. My dream objects must be real because they appear real in my dream. That's refuted, as I said, very easily when we wake up and the dream objects aren't there. We will also refute this appearance of things existing ultimately or in a concrete way, an inherent, independent way, an inherent way, when we come to know emptiness fully. Because phenomena do exist conventionally, the non-existence of phenomena conventionally is an extreme of non-existence. Because things still do exist, as I pointed out, they still arise, they're dependent arisings, that would be a deprecation. That would be not allowing things to exist that actually do come into existence based on other factors. So, continuing, he says, avoiding the extremes of existence on one hand, non-existence on the other, however, does not mean that Madhyamikas refrain from making assertions about existence and non-existence, because they do assert that phenomena exist conventionally, but not ultimately, even if those assertions exist only nominally, because everything exists only nominally. It's quite a statement. Let's go back and kind of recap it. They say essentially that we can hold that things have a conventional existence. That keeps them from being utterly non-existent, right? They exist conventionally. We're going to explore this shortly. What does that really mean? How do they exist conventionally? Well, we know they arise from causes and conditions because we've already talked about that, but there are even deeper ways that we can relate to their way of coming into existence. And that was what was referred to as nominal existence. But we'll hold on to that thought. Over here, we say that they don't exist ultimately because when we go looking for some sort of ultimate findable existence, we don't find it. So holding to this extreme doesn't make sense because we posit emptiness of inherent existence. Holding to this extreme doesn't make sense because we posit dependent arising. And dependent arising and emptiness are speaking to two sides of the same thing. This is dependent existence. This is a lack of independent existence. As you try to use those terms as much as possible, because it makes a lot of sense when we use similar words, right? Dependent existence on one side, on the other side, a lack of independent existence. Okay? All right. Is everybody with me still? We don't have too much time left. In fact, I think we're almost out of time. Let me see what I have left to cover and whether I can cover any of this. I think the third section is probably a little too long to go into. Okay, we'll start with that tomorrow morning and kind of see. We're stopping at 8:30, yes? Okay, I just wanted to make sure I'm not stopping prematurely on this. So let's see if there are questions on what I talked about so far tonight. Because I really do want, as we go through this, because the verses themselves, there are a number of verses where we probably won't even do that much commentary on. They're fairly straightforward. The heart of all of it is the subject matter in the very beginning. And if we're oriented towards it, then the verses reveal themselves as being Tsongkhapa's own insight into what we mean by these terms. But if we have some preliminary investigation, then I think it really will aid when we get to the actual text. So I don't want to leave anybody behind. I don't want anybody to feel like, oh, I can't come back, because it was just way, way too deep, way over my head. I hope the way I've talked about it tonight hasn't been, again, too highfalutin. I don't know if people use that word anymore, but anyone? Do we have any questions online? Or
If you have a question online, if you're on YouTube, you can put it in the chat. If you're on Zoom, just raise your hand or get my attention. If you're in here in the Kadampa, just let me know. Raise your hand if you have a question. Jack.
okay. Jack has a question here in the Kadampa, so we'll get the microphone to him so everyone can hear the question.
It's more of a comment.
Oh, okay, great.
When we talk about emptiness, and when I was learning how to spell Buddhism and emptiness, it became a voidness.
Right.
And so for the X number of years, I had to say emptiness of inherent existence, so that way it takes it all the way through. So tonight, when you threw out emptiness, it wasn't always tied together. So I'm concerned about some people missing that piece of it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, Jack. And that is an important part of it, is to not, that word emptiness in and of itself, like you said, sometimes it's even translated as voidness, but we always have to say, but then empty of what, or void of what? What is it that we are voiding? What is it that we are negating? There's always something else. There's always something that we are talking about. And even when the Buddha taught some of these coarser versions of what we sometimes refer to as selflessness as opposed to emptiness, we were talking still about something that you have to say doesn't exist. There's a negation of that. So I'll try to be mindful of that, but I also do want people to kind of interpret. Anytime I use the word emptiness, at least, that word primarily, we are talking about, the fact that things lack a particular mode of existence. They lack inherent existence. In fact, I'll put on the screen right now, I brought it up on my Kindle, all the various synonyms that Jeffrey Hopkins, in his meditation on emptiness, that he uses for this. Look, so I start at the bottom of the page there. These are 17 kind of, he calls them hypothetical synonyms because they don't exist. Inherent existence is used here, but this is kind of what we mean by self when we say selflessness. You could say that things are empty of true establishment, empty of true existence, empty of ultimate existence, empty of existing as its own suchness, empty of existing as its own reality. You're not getting these on the screen here, sorry. It's page 36 of Meditation on Emptiness. Empty of natural existence, and so on, substantial existence. I'm not going to go through the whole list. We have many ways that we can refer to this sort of fictitious way that things exist. But when we use the word emptiness without that modification, without that, saying it's empty of that, then it does start to feel a bit nihilistic, right? It's all emptiness, it's all voidness. There's nothing. It's not nothing. It is a negation of a specific thing that we have believed in from beginningless time. Kind of the same, well, maybe it's not the same way. I'll come up with a better example. But thank you for bringing that up, Jack. I think it is important that we not fall into that trap. Some people have said to me, well, could you call emptiness fullness? And I'm like, well, you can in the sense of dependent arising. There is a fullness that comes together with emptiness. It is empty of inherent existence, but it is full of dependent origination. I mean, in the sense that the world is a full world. There's everything around us. There's all the phenomena, the diverse things that exist, and they all have an empty nature. They don't exist from their own side. Yeah, Don, I think.
Don, you have something?
Hello? It is? Yeah, the term gotcha.
Gotcha, yeah.
I mean, I've heard descriptions of it, I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about. Jeffrey's talking about intrinsic existence, inherent existence, existing. Right. The Tibetan term is gotcha.
Gotcha, yeah.
Is that right?
That's correct.
And I mean, it's the object of negation.
Right.
So that which is being refuted or that doesn't exist. When we go looking for it, we can't find it. You can't. I like the word gotcha for some reason. It's a lot easier, but it's sort of interesting because it's like we look for this gotcha and we don't find it.
Right.
And then and we realize that we're empty of that and everything else is empty of that. And that's
Sure.
kind of cool because then there's some space in the mind to actually experience reality. But, I think sometimes these teachings on emptiness too are also, like, I can understand, I remember Jeffrey Hopkins one time, I asked him this question, and he said, things, he says, pretty obvious that a tree comes from the seed and blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
It grows seed and light and fertilizer, and it grows and then plants and everything. It's pretty obvious. That's not profound, that things exist in dependence upon causes and conditions, and independence upon parts, and not a consciousness that designates it. That's not profound. That's pretty obvious. That's conventional reality, right? And that's what I think I'm not what's the word? Is it conventional reality? What's the Sanskrit word is it for that? Is it samvarcha?
I know the Tibetan gunso.
Is it samvarcha satya? I'm trying to remember what Jeffrey said, but he said that's not all that profound.
Yeah.
What's profound is that the way it appears and the way it exists are not congruent.
Right.
They're the opposite. And it was really struck me.
Yeah. And all this we'll be going into as part of the weekend is that incongruence between the way things appear and the way they actually exist when we analyze, go deeper, go beyond the surface. But this gakcha it was something we'll also touch on a bit tomorrow, in terms of gakcha, again, is Tibetan for object of negation. It's those synonyms I put on the screen from, Jeffrey Hopkins. It's the thing that we are falsely believing in. Sometimes I use the example, as I was going to use this earlier, but I'm not sure it fits everything that we're talking about, of like a child who is, having nightmares and they're convinced that there's a monster in the room, right? Because of the belief in that. So for a child, that's their gakcha, right? That's the thing that you want to negate. Because that child is suffering every night, anxiety because they don't want to go to sleep because they're afraid of the monster in the room, right? And similarly, you have to kind of do an analysis, some reasoning to show the child that the monster doesn't exist. But you just say, oh, that was just a dream. It's not real, da-da-da-da. And then every night the child goes to sleep, the monster's there again, Well, you have to find a way to refute it. And so you maybe need to get out the flashlight and go in all the corners of the room and in the closet and, show that the monster's not there. And maybe after repeated, trying to show the reality, eventually the child lets go of this idea that there is a monster, and hopefully the nightmares go away and what have you. But you want something, it's a similar concept in that it would be nothing if it was just simply a philosophical exercise. This is why we're suffering, folks, is because we believe in the gakcha. We believe that things are real in the way that this ignorance is holding them and in the way that they appear. So reconciling all of that, working with all of that is the challenge, I agree. How do I actually go past the way things appear? And this is why, as we're going to see, even all these lower schools of tenet systems that precede Prasangika in terms of their point of view, all of them are convinced that that's how things exist because that is how they appear. They can't really explain away, that they hold on to that. That's the life preserver again, that you can want to hold on to as you go out into the middle of the pond, that you don't want to drown. I've got to hold on to that. If that doesn't exist, nothing exists. So this is what we're working with this weekend is, although again, there is some profundity even within these levels of dependent arising, we have to get that this is driving us to negate this false sense of things existing and ourselves existing. That's the point. If it doesn't get to that, then it doesn't get to the ignorance and doesn't get to liberation, enlightenment, what have you. So I think we should conclude for tonight since we are a little bit over, and I do want to be mindful it is a Friday night and people are a bit tired perhaps from the week. So let's go ahead, and if you do have questions, by the way, please write them down. Keep them. There'll be an opportunity for questions. I like to at least give one opportunity in each session so that we have an ability for people to interact and discuss some of this. So let's go ahead and do the prayers. And we'll do the, oh, no, you've got it on yours. Okay. Yeah, okay, good.
If you're in the Gampa, it's page 246.
And again, those who are joining us in Spanish language, feel free to recite these in the Spanish as we go through this. We're dedicating again for all beings, but we might at this time hold those beings whose situation in particular is quite difficult right now, beings we know or places in the world where there's great suffering, bring them to mind as we dedicate for the welfare of all beings. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may these never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And let's dedicate for the good health and long life of all our teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all the other teachers that we ourselves have connections with. And then lastly, also dedicate for the swift return of Kabji Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Zopa, our precious spiritual guide, so that we and others will benefit from his presence in this world once again. Okay, thank you all for joining tonight, and look forward to seeing you throughout the weekend. And you might, since you do have this handout and I didn't get through all of it, you might just take a look at it, but don't go past, because I think it starts getting into material that I won't cover till later on page 5. So actually, if you read just these first 4 pages, we were already into the 3rd page, just a little bit more. If you get a chance to do that before tomorrow, it might help a little bit, just to see what questions you might have, or how good a job I do of explaining the material, but anyway.
Thank you, Don. I have a couple of quick announcements that I want to cover. Tomorrow, Saturday, we will start at 10 o'clock. And we'll go until noon. We'll have a lunch break. If you are staying all day, please bring a bagged lunch, and those of us who are here can stay on campus and on site. The day is supposed to be gorgeous, so we can continue our discussion about what has been discussed so far in clarifying the middle way. And on Sunday, we start at 10:30 with our regular Dharma connection, okay? And that'll be from 10:30 to 12, and it's all about adopting an attitude of gratitude. But then we'll pick up the weekend workshop after lunch at 1:30. So back here in the Gampa or online. All right, hope to see everyone then. Have a good night.
Thank you, Linda.
Oh, and materials are posted online for the weekend workshop, so be sure to check those out.
Yeah, especially the text to have all of that. I didn't get a chance to introduce you to those materials, but I'll do that first thing tomorrow then. Okay, thank you all. Okay.
Good night, everyone on Zoom and YouTube.